So, good morning everyone. This is Santosh. Today we are going to discuss about basic part of semiconductors. So, before going into basic part of semiconductors, let me give you a overview of semiconductors. What are meant by semiconductors? Yesterday we have discussed about the different types of electronic devices that are being categorized into three categories: conductors, insulators, and semiconductors based upon the energy gap between the conduction band and valency band. Today we are going to discuss about semiconductors, which are one of the electronic components. So what are meant by semiconductors? Semiconductors are nothing but which have minimal energy gap between conductors and insulators, so that valency electron can jump from valency band to conduction band very easily, and those properties always lies between conductors and insulators. Semiconductors properties always lies between conductors and conductors and insulators. So now, as we know what are meant by semiconductors, there are two kinds of semiconductors. One is intrinsic semiconductor and extrinsic semiconductor. So let us move into intrinsic semiconductors. What are meant by intrinsic semiconductors? Intrinsic semiconductors are nothing but pure semiconductors. These intrinsic semiconductors always act as insulators at lower temperatures and conductors at higher temperatures. So they will not possess any conducting properties between the conductors and insulators. So we are not going to use intrinsic semiconductors in developing the electronic circuits or electronic devices. So for developing the electronic devices and circuits, we will move on for one more type of semiconductors known as extrinsic semiconductors. These extrinsic semiconductors are generally formed by doping some sort of impurities to the intrinsic semiconductor. That is nothing but when we add some impurities to the intrinsic semiconductor, they are known as extrinsic semiconductors. So the adding of impurities to a intrinsic semiconductor is known as doping, which is a very important concept and which will be asked for a 2 marks question in the examination. Doping, what is meant by doping? Doping is just nothing but adding impurities to the pure semiconductor. So semiconductors are of two types: intrinsic semiconductors and extrinsic semiconductors. So intrinsic semiconductors are pure semiconductors which will be acting as an insulator at lower temperatures and which will be acting as conductor at higher temperature. So generally we will not be using that in developing the electronic circuits or devices. So we will be moving on for extrinsic semiconductors. Extrinsic semiconductors are nothing but which are formed by adding some impurities to the intrinsic semiconductors. So extrinsic semiconductors are of two categories. One is p-type semiconductor and two is n-type semiconductor. P-type semiconductors are formed by adding trivalent impurities. When we add trivalent impurities to an intrinsic semiconductor, we will be getting an p-type semiconductor. And n-type semiconductors are formed when we add pentavalent impurities to the intrinsic semiconductors. So next, when we combine this p-type semiconductor and n-type semiconductor, we can develop a device known as a diode. Diode is just nothing but it is an electronic device which conducts electricity in only one direction. We can't observe the electricity in another direction, which will be conducting electricity in only one direction. So it was known as unidirectional device. And diode is the primary electronic component of any electronic device. So diode is formed by a combination of p-type semiconductor and n-type semiconductor. So diode is basic example of semiconductors. So let us move on to diode symbol. Diode symbol will be looking like this. The front part is just nothing but cathode and second part is nothing but anode. So diode will be represented in this way. And next we are going to see two conditions here. Diode can be operated in two ways. One is forward bias condition and second thing is reverse bias condition. So what is meant by forward bias condition? So when the positive is connected to positive and negative is connected to negative, then it is known as forward bias condition. See, when we connect positive to positive and negative to negative, automatically repulsion will take place and holes will be moving towards the junction, and our electrons will be moving towards the junction, and there we will be forming a diffusion gradient in between them. That is just nothing but a junction between them, which is a gradient of p type carriers and n type carriers. So in the forward bias condition, we'll be getting some current in the device that is going to be connected to this circuit. When we reverse bias, this reverse bias in the sense negative is connected to positive and positive is connected to negative. When we do this,